questions with who was. Who was your first crush? Who was your role model? Who was your first mentor? Who was your favorite artist? Who was your first teacher? Who was your first teacher? Who was your first boyfriend? Who was your first girlfriend? Who was your childhood hero? Who was your initial co-worker? Who was your favorite comedian? Who was your first celebrity crush? Who was your childhood best friend? Who was the last person you hugged? Who was the person you last hugged? Who was the last person you hugged? Who was your childhood chess coach? Who was your childhood sports coach? Who was your childhood sports coach? Who was your trusted physics teacher? Who was your supportive speech coach? Who was your high school best friend? Who was your favorite childhood leader? Who was your guiding figure growing up? Who was your favorite historical figure? Who was your first friend in a new city? Who was your first friend in a new city? Who was your favorite childhood pen pal? Who was your childhood choir director? Who was your closest childhood friend? Who was your favorite coach in sports? Who was your memorable drama coach? Who was your favorite musician or band? Who was your significant career mentor? Who was the first person you met today? Who was your respected manager at work? Who was your memorable history teacher? Who was your respected geography teacher? Who was the last person you laughed with? Who was your favorite childhood neighbor? Who was your favorite teacher in college? Who was your favorite childhood playmate? Who was your favorite athlete as a child? Who was your valued childhood tour guide? Who was your favorite childhood classmate? Who was the most talented person you know? Who was the most talented person you know? Who was your favorite fictional character? Who was your essential technology teacher? Who was your cherished childhood playmate? Who was your appreciated chemistry teacher? Who was your valuable escape room teammate? Who was your childhood adventure companion? Who was your appreciated coding instructor? Who was your influential college professor? Who was the last person you gave a gift to? Who was your respected robotics instructor? Who was the last person you had dinner with? Who was the last person you talked to today? Who was your influential wildlife biologist? Who was the author of the last book you read? Who was your favorite childhood museum guide? Who was the last person you went hiking with? Who was the last person you went jogging with? Who was the first person you called for advice? Who was the last person you went jogging with? Who was the first person you called for advice? Who was your trustworthy improv comedy partner? Who was the last person you went on a trip with? Who was the last person you called on the phone? Who was your childhood research project partner? Who was your favorite character in a comic book? Who was your favorite character in a video game? Who was the last person you went for coffee with? Who was the guest at the last party you attended? Who was the last person you shared a recipe with? Who was your indispensable trivia night teammate? Who was the last person you shared a memory with? Who was the last person you went to a party with? Who was the last person you went to a party with? Who was the last person you went to the gym with? Who was the last person you attended a party with? Who was the last person you went on a picnic with? Who was the last person you helped with something? Who was the first person you shared a secret with? Who was the last person you went for a drive with? Who was your favorite childhood teammate in games? Who was your reliable robotics competition partner? Who was the last person you sent a text message to? Who was the last person you attended an event with? Who was the last person you borrowed something from? Who was the last person you had a disagreement with? Who was your vital community service project partner? Who was your favorite character in a play or musical? Who was your favorite character in a play or musical? Who was your favorite musician when you were a child? Who was the first person you met at your current job? Who was your favorite singer when you were a teenager? Who was the last person you shared a funny story with? Who was the historical figure you find most interesting? Who was the first person you met at your current school? Who was the last person you had a long conversation with? Who was the last person you went to a cultural event with? Who was the last person you had a heart-to-heart talk with? Who was the last person you congratulated on an achievement? Who was the chef behind the delicious meal you had recently? Who was the first person you met when you moved to a new place? Who was the last person you sent a text message to? Who was the last person you attended an event with? Who was the last person you